In June 2016, 52% of the British electorate voted to leave the European Union, a decision framed as taking back control, securing borders, building a stronger, independent Britain. But today, nearly a decade later, that decision looks less like a bold new chapter and more like the most expensive mistake Britain has ever made by choice. The economy is smaller, the NHS is in crisis, migration hit record highs, and the promised renaissance? It never came.
I feel betrayed.
It was never a good idea.
To understand the failure, you first have to understand what was sold. The Leave campaign didn't just promise sovereignty, it promised a transformation. A Britain free from Brussels, in control of its borders, redirecting billions back into public services, striking bold trade deals with the whole world. Global Britain, they called it. And the centerpiece of that vision? Painted on the side of a red bus. We send the EU £350 million a week. Let's fund our NHS instead. It was everywhere, on television, driving through every major city in Britain. And it landed hard. Because the NHS, underfunded, overstretched, beloved, is the one thing most British people would do almost anything to protect. There was just one problem. The number was wrong. The UK Statistics Authority called it a clear misuse of official statistics. The real figure, after Britain's rebate and EU money flowing back into the country, was closer to £180 million a week, not £350 million. The Institute for Fiscal Studies called the campaign's numbers clearly absurd. But here's what the people behind the campaign understood. Accuracy didn't matter. Emotion did. And within hours of the result being announced, the architects of that promise were already walking away from it. Nigel Farage distanced himself on live television.
No, I can't, and I would never have made that claim. That was one of the mistakes I think that the Leave campaign made.
Hang on a moment, that was one of your adverts.
Well, it wasn't one of my adverts, I can assure you.
Well, that was one of the Leave campaign's adverts. That money was going to go to the NHS.
And I think they made a mistake.
That's why.
Ian Duncan Smith said he never made it.
Well, the £350 million was an extrapolation of the £19.1 billion. That's the total amount of money that last year we gave across to the European Union. We can talk about money's back and everything else.
Your side said it was all going to go to the NHS.
Well, actually, what we actually said was a significant amount of it will go to the NHS, and that is essentially down to the government, but I actually believe that is what was pledged, and that's what should happen.
The campaign director later called it a mistake, the most powerful promise of the entire campaign, abandoned before breakfast. The bus said £350 million a week would go to the NHS. What the NHS actually got was a staffing crisis it still hasn't recovered from. Before Brexit, the health service ran heavily on European workers. Doctors and nurses who could move freely, register quickly, and fill gaps the domestic system couldn't cover. No visa applications. No salary thresholds. They arrived, they worked, they kept the wards running. Then came the result. Between September 2016 and March 2017, the number of EU-trained nurses registering to work in the UK fell by 88%. In 6 months, without a single new law being passed. The vote alone was enough to drive them away, so Britain went looking elsewhere. And it found workers in places that could spare them the least. By 2024, roughly 1 in 11 NHS doctors in England came from countries the World Health Organization classifies as red list nations. Countries so short of their own healthcare workers that the WHO formally advises other nations not to recruit from them. Nigeria, Ghana, Zimbabwe. 93% of new nurses who joined the NHS in the 4 years prior were recruited internationally. The original plan was for overseas hires to cover just a quarter of that number, and the drug supply broke alongside the workforce. In 2024, Britain recorded its worst medicine shortages in 4 years. The UK now has the lowest import growth in medicines of any G7 country. The bus promised billions for the NHS. Brexit cost the public finances an estimated £40 billion in lost tax revenues in the 5 years after leaving. Money that was never generated, never available to spend. The promise went one way, the waiting lists went the other. The economic case for Brexit was straightforward. Free from EU regulations and membership fees, Britain would grow faster, strike bolder trade deals, attract more investment. Here is what actually happened. By 2025, Brexit had reduced UK GDP per capita by 6 to 8% compared to where it would have been had Britain stayed in. That is the conclusion of a landmark study from the National Bureau of Economic Research, drawing on nearly a decade of data. Business investment fell 12 to 18% below comparable economies. The British pound fell 12% on the night of the result and has never fully recovered. Every import, machinery, food, consumer goods became more expensive as a result. Trade took a hit too. In the first 2 years after Brexit took full effect, UK exports to the EU fell by 14%. EU exports to the UK fell by just 7%. The larger trading bloc held the structural advantage. It always does. Food prices rose by an estimated 6% on average due to Brexit-related red tape alone. Dairy and meat saw increases of 10 to 15% directly attributable to trade friction rather than global inflation. And the global trade deals that were supposed to replace all of this? The UK-Australia deal, celebrated as proof of global Britain, is projected to add 0.08% to GDP over 15 years. The US deal, promised for nearly a decade, remains unsigned. The average British citizen is roughly £2,000 worse off every year as a direct result of Brexit. Not the pandemic, not Ukraine, a domestic political choice. Of all the promises the Leave campaign made, the one about immigration has aged the worst. The argument was simple. Inside the EU, Britain couldn't control who came. Outside it, numbers would fall. Borders would mean something again. The numbers went up. Net migration exceeded 600,000 people in 2022. The average during Britain's last decade inside the EU was around 250,000. Brexit didn't reduce migration. It more than doubled it. Channel crossings hit record highs. In 2022, more than 45,000 people crossed in small boats. In 2018, that figure was 299. In the first 11 months of 2025, crossings reached over 39,000 with a month still to go. Here is why. Brexit removed Britain from the Dublin regulation, the legal framework that allowed the UK to return asylum seekers to the first EU country they entered. That mechanism was handed away in negotiations. Nothing replaced it. Without the legal route to removal, the crossings accelerated. Brexit was sold on controlling the border. The tools that made the border controllable were surrendered in the same deal. For a long time, opinions stayed split. But a decade of lived experience has a way of cutting through the noise. As of June 2025, 56% of people in Great Britain believe Brexit was the wrong decision. Only 31% still think it was right. 61% describe it as more of a failure than a success. Among 18 to 24-year-olds, 70% say it was the wrong call. The generation that will live longest with the consequences is the most clear-eyed about what those consequences are.